Hi, my name is Sanjay Nandaraja. I'm a consultant at Inglasia Pharma Solutions. This brief training is on how to perform good distribution practice audits. Typically, these are one-day audits of any vendor within the supply chain of medicines. Being a one-day audit, there's a lot to consider within that one day for this audit. My advice would be that you prepare well ahead by producing the agenda to cover the areas that you'd want to look at during the audit. Understand what are some of the challenges with that vendor, understand whether there have been any previous audits where there were observations that need to be closed out. Also, see if there have been any concerns over the time that you utilize their services, or whether you know of anyone that have utilized their services that have raised any concerns with that vendor, and make sure that you incorporate those areas that you'd want to check within the audit agenda. Typically, the audit agenda needs to be sent to the vendor 1 month before the date of the audit, so it gives them sufficient time to gather any prerequisite documents for yourself to have a look at prior to performing that on-site audit. What we have here is a list of high-level areas that we'd want to look into more detail during the audit. So for good distribution practices, one of the first things that I'd want to understand is really the people. The people, whether they are fully qualified to do the tasks, are they trained, do they have a job description, do they have a training file, and how is their training being managed on an ongoing basis. I'll look at all the supporting documents around this to see that there is evidence. One of the things I'd recommend is when you perform the on-site audit that you question the auditees who are performing those particular tasks. For example, in goods receipt, if there's someone actually performing the task of booking in the medicinal products into the warehouse, have a look at their job description, have a look at their training file, and have a look at the procedures they've been trained on to see that it all matches up and there's no anomalies. Also, the next area I would want to look at is the quality management system. Now, this is quite a big area to assess, and I've broken it down to some of the priorities that I'd want to consider when I'm on site. So these would be looking at the quality management reviews and how regularly these are taking place, and just to see evidence that these are being performed. Deviations are being recorded somewhere, and these files are being kept up to date, and there's no overdue deviations. Change controls, exactly the same, to see that we got a log of these and to have a look at some to see how these are being performed if they're able to share. Corrective action, preventive actions, and having a look at the log of these and whether any of these are overdue. Complaints, recalls, and counterfeits. So what processes are in place for these and how these managed. Again, looking at some sample examples of what's been done to see how well these are being documented. And risk management and how they're utilizing this tool, and are they regularly assessing their risks to reduce the risk level within the business. Then moving on to premises, here we're really looking at the things that have been put in place on site in terms of pest control, security, cleaning, and temperature, most importantly, and how this is being maintained within the facility, and how it's being monitored on an ongoing basis, and what are the records that are available to show that this is all being managed well and there are no gaps in terms of how they are performing these checks. And if things were to go wrong, how is this documented, and where is that documentation held? So look at some examples to see how well these are being looked into, and whether the right solutions are being identified whenever there has been some sort of a failure. And essentially around equipment, it's really the critical piece of equipment that sort of come to my mind are the warehouse management system, the EQMS, and the planned preventative maintenance program. So with these, how we qualifying these, how we keeping on top of these in terms of making sure that they're in a validated state, and how these are being maintained on an ongoing basis. So look for records around these as much as possible to see that there is something there in place to give you assurance that these systems are robust, and there are contingencies if there were any kind of failures with any of these. And then we move on to operations and the activities that they perform on a day-to-day basis. Certainly, they will be sourcing and supplying. They'll be interacting with their customers and their clients. And what are the licenses in place for these parties that are involved in your supply chain? So check for licenses, certifications, and registrations to show that these parties are appropriately licensed with respect to them handling medicinal products. And these checks need to make sure that are being performed on a regular basis and not being left for years and years without being checked. Also, with regards to operations, we need to look at goods in, how we're receiving the products into the warehouse, how we're doing these checks, where are these checks being documented, and looking at some samples to see that these are being filled in correctly and the information is accurate, to look for any anomalies there. Also, how we then move the products into the warehouse, how we store them, in terms of sort of the status of the product. How is that managed? Is that managed with the warehouse management system to show the status of the product, or is it physically segregated in some ways? And the same goes for sort of quarantine and reject as well. How is those areas defined? Are they defined segregated areas? Are they physically segregated, or are they electronically segregated? Is there any visual labeling to help? So my advice here is the more there is in terms of controls around the segregation, the better. So certainly you want to see that they're clearly labeled. If it's a reject or return product or recall product, they need to be physically segregated as well, not just having a sort of a labeling on the product to show the status, because this is the best practice way to do it. And returns as well, how is that being managed? How is the responsible person being involved in returns and assessing those and making the decision on whether to put it back into available stock or to move it to reject? So how is that being documented? And look at some examples again on how returns are being processed to see that if you were to pick up that product that's been returned, would you be happy with the level of assessment that's been done on that return product? So do look at a real example to see whether what they've done is appropriate. And here we also have audits. And what we mean here is that the vendor that you're auditing, are they performing internal audits, self-inspections of their processes to see that they are keeping that high level of compliance, or are they not? And are we finding gaps in terms of performing internal audits in certain areas of their business? So keep an eye on that as well when you do the audit, that they are performing self-inspections. And then the distributor typically might be outsourcing certain activities to third parties in terms of overflow warehouse or transportation providers, or even using an archive facility for storing their documentation. So any of these, make sure that they're on an audit program. They are being regularly audited. They're not behind on audits. Typically, you'd expect an audit every 3 to 2 years, depending on the level of activity there with that vendor. And also, are there any quality technical agreements in place with those vendors. So these things also need to be checked to see that there are valid documents in place and audit reports are being written and being closed out on time. So hopefully this has given you a nice snapshot of some of the things to look at during a GDP audit. There's certainly a lot here to look at, even though I've gone through this quite quickly. When you start going into each of these areas, you'll find that there are a number of documents to look at that will certainly start to fill your day as an auditor. However, certainly before you go into looking at these documents, when you perform the audit, I would recommend that the first half of the day be understanding the business model, how they operate, how products are moved in that supply chain, when does that vendor take responsibility, and when does their responsibility end, and then having a look at the site by doing a physical tour to see where things are and to then pick on certain individuals in terms of looking at their training records around their job role and to see that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing and they're competently trained to perform those tasks. So your first half of the day would certainly be having a look around the facility as much as possible and to start to gather some understanding of what they do, and then typically the second half is kind of then picking on some sample documents to check based on what you've seen in the morning's tour of the facility. Thank you very much for listening. If you do have any more questions, then feel free to contact me at info@inglasia.com